Have that much time, so I'd like to open the floor to questions, and if there aren't any, then I'll ask a few, but let's get some contributions from the audience. I'll field them. So the woman with the glasses on?
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. If you want to field them, you can do so.
Oh, I was never going to.
Okay, super. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you all very much for your talks. I had a question specifically for Dr. Mallory. So you had mentioned that, if I understand correctly, that Baathism was originally conceived of by Greek Orthodox Christians who had been borrowing from European nationalistic and socialistic ideals. I was very fascinated by the mechanism by which this ostensibly unifying, secularizing, nationalistic identity became mobilized as a tool to actually oppress Christians and other minority groups. Additionally, there have been some proposals for federated systems, of course, with Christians perhaps occupying their own areas. What might be some concerns that this type of system would further isolate Christians within Syria, for example, and render their government more susceptible to outside influence? And in most of the contemporary federalist schemes that have been proposed, how much autonomy relative to the overall state would Christian groups have? Thank you very much.
Do you want to respond? Let's take a few more questions and then have some folks respond. I think that makes sense. So the gentleman back there with the red tie.
Thank you. I also have a question for Dr. Mallory. You use a term a couple times, 2 or 3 times in your discussion, the term thimitude, which of course is a problematic term, having its origins in the 1970s, kind of Lebanese political discussion, but then kind of entering the scholastic discourse through the works of Bat-Yor. I was wondering, the problem with the term, of course, is it tends to flatten or level any historical nuance in terms of the Christian experience in the Islamic world, specifically the Middle East. I was wondering if you could provide a working definition in terms of how you conceive of thimitude, and whether or not if you can maybe add some detail in terms of the contours of the definition.
Mm-hmm. Great. The gentleman over there, I'm sorry, I'm making you run around a great deal. It's good exercise.
There you go.
Between World War I and World War II, and then again after World War II, there was discussion of forming a Fertile Crescent Union that would comprise Iraq, Syria, also Lebanon, and Jordan. But I wonder whether the international community, viewing the reluctance of the Syrian and Iraq regimes to be inclusive, shouldn't be thinking of a larger federation, Fertile Crescent Union, uniting Syria and Iraq as a federation to include a lot of different kinds of minorities.
That's what Daesh wants to do.
Okay, so let's take these 3 questions first. 2 are addressed specifically to Dr. Malik, and the other one, I think anybody was welcome to respond to.
Okay, the first question, I think, if I understood it, is you want to try and see if a federal formula will, as you said, perhaps isolate the Christians in Syria, or will it increase their autonomy? Look, in principle, in theory, my view is that divided or heterogeneous societies, mixed societies, composite ones, the best political arrangement for them is some form of creative federalism. The most successful states in the world happen to be federal states. Now, and the good news is that federalism is such a malleable concept, it can almost be tailored to accommodate any number of givens, of local givens that can be different. It doesn't have to be geographic, meaning there don't have to be movements of populations for federalism to work. There can be mixed areas, and the federal formula can apply constitutionally. You can even have, if in the mixed areas you have neighborhoods that are of one color embedded within larger neighborhoods of another color, let's say we're talking in terms of religious communities, you could have the Swedish idea of the ombudsman, which would offer an extra layer of protection over and above the federal law for that embedded minority within a minority. So, I mean, legal experts can certainly come up with ways to accommodate all of this and perhaps allay many of our fears in advance. The problem is not here. The problem is that the very concept is highly suspect in the Middle East. And you will see repeatedly people like Hassan Nasrallah on television, La lil federala, waving his finger as if federalism is some sort of satanic Western plot to destroy the Arab world. This identification between federalism and fragmentation is one of the problems, and we need a lot of education to bring it about, number one. Number two, for federalism to succeed, it has to really be bottom up, not top down. This is not a kind of replay of the Sykes-Picot agreement a la federal instead of unitary state. No, but for it to be bottom up, it means enough suffering has to happen on the bottom that will bring some of these groups closer to one another to want to come up with this sort of arrangement. Now, I've talked to many Sunni Lebanese friends of mine, and the last community that might be interested in federalism would be the Sunnis because of their history of being the majority, what Dr. Watton Paul mentioned, Sunni chauvinism. I mean, being born almost with a gold spoon in your mouth that you are destined to rule others because you're Sunni. But interestingly enough, those I've talked to in Lebanon are so, how shall I put it, so fed up with living with Shiites after their, the experience with Hezbollah and so on. They are even saying, let's go for a federal. Sunnis are saying we need federalism, you see. So federalism is not a panacea for anything, and it's full of challenges, but I see it as the most viable roadmap forward to accommodate minorities. That would be my answer to that question generally. The other one was about dhimmitude. No, dhimmitude is, I beg to differ, is not a fabrication of 1970s Lebanon. Nor is it something that Bat Ye'or, a fine scholar, sort of dreamt up one day. It is, in fact, it goes all the way back to the what are known as the conditions of the Caliph Omar, which draws very much from the Quran and from early manifestations of Islamic law to deal with what is known Quranically as the people of the book, namely Christians and Jews, who occupy that sort of middle area, right, between believing Muslims and complete pagans. And because they have had, according to the Islamic narrative, they have had the book revealed to them, but for some reason, they garbled it all up, you see, and they produced first the Old Testament and then the Gospels. So what we have with dhimmitude really is a system of imposed restrictions. And this conference is about genocide, right? I wouldn't go so far as to say that dhimmitude is a form of slow genocide, but it is definitely not, as many historians have, Western historians have peddled throughout the 20th century, like Bernard Lewis and others. Dhimmitude is not a recipe for tolerance. If anything, it is a slow recipe for liquidating communities. Because the cumulative effect of all of these restrictions becomes a gradual physical and also psychological inferiorization and eventually alienation from what you really are. And if that is not a definition for liquidation, I don't know what is. I can go much more into this, but I'll just leave you with these few thoughts.
Professor Watton, how did you want to respond to the last question?
No.
Does anybody want to respond to the last question?
For federalism?
No.
Well, on the possibility of a federation between
I can
Iraq
say
and
something
Syria.
if I can say something about that. Look, we had the experience in 1958 when Mr. Nasser wanted to have a union with Syria and include Lebanon. The problem with these things is they might sound interesting and useful on the surface, But in the context, especially in the 1950s when, for all practical purposes, the Cold War was at its height, and many nations who tried to group themselves since Bandung in 1955 as the non-aligned nations were very gradually and systematically being co-opted into the communist camp against the West. In that kind of situation, plus given, you see, very strong sectarian feelings and feelings of domination by the Sunni majority, any such unions trigger all sorts of alarm bells for minorities. That's why you had the 1958 crisis in Lebanon. And that's why President Chamoun and his foreign minister, my late father, were against this union. So unions in general are very treacherous concepts in places like the Middle East when all sorts of agendas that ultimately boil down to something against minorities are at play. That would be, again, a suggestion as an answer.
Okay, let me use my privilege as moderator to ask a few questions of some of the folks on the stage who have not yet gotten a question, and perhaps one to Professor Malik as well. But Professor Belange, I have one clarificatory question and one sort of appeal to dilation, if you will. The clarificatory question is, you began to talk, if I understood you correctly, and said that the root of civil war was demography. And I wonder what you meant by that exactly. Do you mean the root of the demonstrations, or do you mean the root of the civil war that ensued subsequently? Are you talking about a correlation, or are you talking about a causal relationship? And if you could say a little bit more about the mechanisms by which demography produced whatever the political outcome you're trying to explain is, because I wasn't exactly sure of that. And the dilation question is more about, some folks have argued that calling even Alawis the Alawis is itself a kind of reification, if you will, a production of a groupness that rides roughshod over the kind of heterogeneity and variation we might also want to think about. So when you're understanding, if you could say a little bit more about, say, the differences between Alawis in the area of Homs, for example, and Alawis in the area of the coastal region, if you could talk a little bit more about how some of those differences might matter even to the Assad regime in terms of, say, a political economy of patronage, which you mentioned to some extent, and whether you think in any way those differences ought to also be part of our theorization. And for Professor Malik, I had a lot of questions, but I'll just stick to one. I was wondering if you thought that the kind of Islamist current that you brought to the fore, is it your view that the initial protests were not in calling for a civil state, projecting the possibility of an inclusive, multi-sectarian or democratic order? Or do you think that from the get-go that this Islamist current was very much animating the uprising? And for Professor Wattenpau, I was very intrigued by your account of the ways in which comparisons have helped you think historically about the specificities of the Armenian community in Aleppo. And I wonder if you could say more about how the kind of comparative cases that you brought to bear on your project have helped you think through both the specificities of the case, but also maybe your understanding of history. We heard about the past is not prologue, but there are resonances, for example, from 1915. Then you talked about a pause, and I wonder sort of what theories of history are allowing you to come up with this intriguing vocabulary. And in thinking about vocabulary more generally, if you could say something a little bit more about what was genocide called before the actual term was coined. So if anybody wants to take one of those, and then we'll open it up again for one more round and then call it quits. So if you, Fabrice, would you like to?
Okay, demography. So, as I said in my presentation, Syria developed a huge demography since 1945. At 1945, the population was 3.5 million of people in Syria. In 2010, it was 21 million of people. So how do you want to have a sustainable development in such condition? I give you an example, simple example. When you had the agrarian reform in 1963, each family in Dera province get 20 hectares of land. One generation after, 1990, you have 8 children, so you have to divide the property in 4 or 5, because the women don't have anything and the son will get heritage. So the property became 4 hectares. Beginning of 2000, each people have 6 children, reduce a little bit. You have to reduce, to divide the property in 3 or 4. But does it mean you have only 1 hectare? Or can you live in such condition? You must change the agriculture. In 1960, in Dera province, it was wheat and olives trees. Does it mean agriculture with no irrigation? So after you need to have irrigation, you need to dig well. So the level of the water is going down, 50 meter, 100 meter. In 2010, after the 5 years of water scarcity in Syria, the level of the water was 200 meters. You need to bring the water from 200 meters. And it was not sustainable. And the Syrian economy, it was not sustainable with this huge demographic growth. There is no oil, no gas in Syria like in Saudi Arabia to provide job and food to the population. Density in rural area around Idlib, it was between 200 and 300 people per square kilometer. It's not hazard if the uprising came from Dera, Idlib, and the suburbs of Homs, of Aleppo, of Damascus, where you have the poverty from the countryside moving to the city, because people want to try to escape to the poverty in the countryside, so they move to the city. But in the city there is no jobs. But thanks to economic liberalization, you have a minority. You become more and more wealthy in Damascus, in Aleppo, and you have a huge frustration in the suburbs, and it's not difficult for the Muslim Brotherhood, from the Salafi, from the association funded by Saudi Arabia to give a little bit money and to encourage the people to protest. So this is one thing about demography. You have in many countries a huge demography, but does it mean the economic development is unsustainable? And we will see with the climate change uprising coming from this problem. And the other thing, Syria, the political system in Syria was built with a kind of equilibrium between the minority, Alawite, Jews, Ismailian, and the Sunni majority. But as I said, the Alawites were 15% of the population in 1980. With all the minority, it was 30% of the population. You have 50% of Kurds. So the Arab majority in 1980 was about 50% of the population. In 2010, the Arab Sunni majority was 63-64% of the population, and a very young population. Instead, the Jews, the Alawites, are more older because they don't make too much children. And so the equilibrium between the community was broken by the different demographic transition. And that's why the Sunni thought that they can take the power. And who in the Sunni population? The poorest people coming from the periphery of the country.
Professor Ballanche,
Yes.
I just have to interrupt you for one moment because I see the organizers getting a little bit
Yeah,
nervous
very
about
antsy
time.
over there.
So we're close to being
Okay.
finished. If we could just, so we'll have to sort of carry on this conversation a bit more in more intimate surroundings. But if I could just ask, because Professor Wattenpau hasn't had a chance to answer anything,
Sure.
he might get the last
I think
word.
that I'll focus on pause real quick, because that's, I think, the most interesting and original idea I've had in a while. I've had 10 years. So I also just wrote a great book. We used to, one of my working theories was that Aleppo represented a site of cultural recovery for the post-genocidal Armenian communities of Anatolia. And that it was relatively safe, but it doesn't account for the fact that despite every international effort to try to keep the Armenians there, that their population continued to decline in Aleppo, but they just moved to Glendale and Fresno and Marseille and Yerevan. And but that the virtue of the community in Syria was that it was so compact that you could maintain these cultural institutions. So one of the things that we do that's very important to us in the contemporary study of genocide is also understanding that, that genocide is not just mass killing. It's the destruction of the basic tendons that hold a society together, including culture and the arts and so on, which is why the destruction of churches and libraries, museums and schools are so important to understand. And I'm not thinking that I was wrong to think that cultural survival was capable in Syria, because the fact of genocide, the form the 1915 genocide took, created a situation in which the Armenians could never be stable as a community in Syria. And I don't want to use the word inevitable, because that is a word historians are not allowed to use. But that there was a certain, the conditions were not propitious to maintaining the Armenians as a community there. And it had not just to do with the international community, the form of the Armenian community in the post-genocide setting, but also just sort of the forms of racism inherent to Syrian society and chauvinism, various ideologies like Nasserism and Baathism, which had problems with this very different community. So I'll just end it right there.
Thank you very much. And please join me in thanking our panelists for an excellent conversation.